In the spring of 1912, RMS Titanic slipped beneath the ocean waves. Her disappearance is riddled with rumor and speculation. The truth has never been completely known. What exactly happened on that terrible night to cause the death of 1,523 men, women, and children? Titanic took many secrets to her final resting place. Now, an unprecedented scientific expedition pieces together Titanic's final hours. Clue by clue, evidence is being gathered. Piece by piece, a story is beginning to unfold. New discoveries are shattering age-old myths. Science is taking us back in time to witness the sinking of the unsinkable Titanic. The French research vessel Nadir is en route to an historic spot some 400 miles off the coast of North America. Her crew is plotting a course to one of the most notorious points in the North Atlantic. The site of the Titanic disaster. The Nadir is joined by another French vessel, Ocean Voyager. On board, an elite team of scientists and engineers, each exploring a phase of the Titanic disaster. Paul Mathias is a leader in underwater imaging technology. He will try to discover the iceberg damage that doomed Titanic. Naval architect Bill Garsky believes clues to the disaster can be found in Titanic steel. Did Titanic steel shatter like glass during the sinking? David Livingstone works for the company that actually built Titanic. He wants to know why she sank so quickly and why she broke in two. Roy Collymore is the team biologist. He wonders if a community of deep-sea organisms is sealing Titanic's ultimate fate. Charles Haas and Jack Eaton are Titanic historians. They'll provide historical context to this investigation. Together, this team will show why a brush with an iceberg proved fatal to a ship built to endure such hazards. A simple buoy and flag mark one boundary of the wreck site. It was in these very waters that the Titanic drama began some 85 years ago. Exploring the Titanic has been likened to conducting a technological orchestra with engineers, divers, and scientists. Great care is taken to prepare gear for the first dive. On the bridge of the Nadir, the captain guides the ship over the wreck site. Directly below lie the remains of the greatest sunken ship of all time. The Titanic tragedy is among the most infamous maritime disasters in history. On her maiden voyage to New York City, she endured a series of events which saw her demise. A glancing blow with an iceberg led to catastrophe. Today, Titanic lies buried in more than 12,000 feet of water. Her bow and stern are separated by nearly a half a mile. The forces that caused this destruction must have been awesome, but the facts of that night have remained elusive, mysterious.
The Titanic is the subject of a great many myths and a great many bits of misinformation. That's why I think this expedition is so significant, because science is giving us the tool to eliminate some of this misinformation and tell what really did happen that night.
Paul Mathias is the first to explore the wreck site. His underwater imaging technology is being loaded onto a state-of-the-art submersible, Natil. This yellow submarine is one of a handful in the world that can take humans down 12,000 feet to the site of Titanic. Mathias will try to uncover the iceberg damage. Legend has it that the iceberg tore a gaping wound into Titanic's side. But nobody knows for sure.
After the Titanic hit the iceberg, there was enough damage to sink her. Exactly what damage occurred to the hull is not known with certainty. The reason is a major part of the front of the bow of the boat is under the mud. And it's been a mystery for 80 years. Today we're going to try to solve that by looking beneath the mud using a seismic profiler, much like a physician might use an ultrasound.
Like a medical ultrasound, this sonar will create images by sending and receiving acoustic signals. Mathias hopes his signal will penetrate the mud, enabling him to see the wound in Titanic's side. Revealing this damage is the first step in reconstructing the disaster. Natil's robotic arms will be used to position the sonar near the mud that hides the damage. Inside the tight confines of Natil, there's room for 3 divers and a deep-sea lab.
This is the first time this kind of approach has been used to image a hull that's buried beneath the mud. I think this is overall going to give us a lot more information about the Titanic than we've ever had before.
The investigation of Titanic is extremely dangerous. More than 5,000 pounds of pressure every square inch will be exerted on the shell of Natil. one tiny crack in the titanium steel would cause Natil to instantly implode. The waters themselves can be very hostile. Freezing temperatures and strong currents add danger to every dive. In the sea, divers free Natil from her lines. In the control room of Nadir, the crew monitors the sub's progress using state-of-the-art visioning software. But if the sub gets in trouble, there's little that can be done from Nadir. For nearly an hour and a half, Natil will free fall on her way to Titanic. Titanic was the pride of Belfast, Northern Ireland, towering over the city where she was built. She was nearly 175 feet tall and 900 feet long. In her day, she was the largest moving object ever built. Her engines were 4 stories high. Each of her 3 propellers were larger than a house. Titanic's hull was comprised of more than 2,000 one-inch thick steel plates, held together by some 3 million rivets.
In many ways, the Titanic set a new standard in terms of her design, especially in the area of safety. There were the latest watertight doors, which were held in place by a magnetic latch, and simply by moving a switch, all of these watertight doors could be closed just by gravity, so that even if power failed, they could be sealed.
Titanic was designed to sustain some damage. The popular press dubbed her invincible and even unsinkable. On her maiden voyage, more than 2,000 passengers and crew would board Titanic, all confident they would reach New York safely. Only 705 completed the journey. In the control room on Nadir, the crew monitors Natil's descent to Titanic.
Well, this is Paul Mathias calling from 3,800 meters below the ocean surface. A couple of very tiny portholes up here in the front that we're looking out of that are 6 inches thick.
Depth indicator says we're at 3,767 meters. That's about 2.5 miles straight down from the ship we left about an hour and a half ago. And I'm looking forward to seeing the bottom come up here any second now. We're finally touched down, and I can see a sandy, muddy bottom here. It's lighted by our lights. It would otherwise be pitch black down here.
Out of the darkness, a figure begins to slowly appear.
One of my impressions about seeing the Titanic is the majesty of it. It's a gigantic ship, still upright. And you can see what was once obviously a very impressive, very well equipped sailing vessel.
Before Matthias searches for the iceberg damage, Natil's robotic arms are brought to life. The pilot activates the claws and carefully clutches the sonar. The investigation begins by recording images of visible damage. This information will help Matthias interpret what he finds under the mud.
Coming up on an edge here, an opening in the hull that we can pick up on the video. This is above the mud line. Here we can see into the hull, and at the same time our seismic profiler's starting to show a nice hyperbolic shape. This confirms that we're starting to pick up openings in the hull with this system. Very encouraging.
After collecting these baseline images, the crew moves on to its biggest challenge: to find the holes that sank Titanic. The use of sonar at this depth to peer through the mud has never been attempted. There is no guarantee of success. The survey takes 3 hours. What will Matthias find buried beneath the mud? The story of Titanic's destruction begins 3 days into her maiden voyage. Titanic's captain, E.J. Smith, receives several ice warnings from other ships. Smith alters course further south to avoid the danger, but he still maintains Titanic's fast speed.
I can't imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Captain Smith.
Smith's confidence would soon be dashed. "11:40 Sunday evening. Lookouts high in the crow's nest spot an iceberg looming in the haze. They ring a warning bell 3 times and message the bridge. From the bridge, the Titanic is turned hard to port. But it's too late. Captain Smith dispatches one of the ship's builders, Thomas Andrews, to assess the damage. Andrews moves quickly into the ship's forward compartments for an inspection. What he sees is devastating. Titanic's hull plating has been dangerously pierced by the iceberg. While the ship was designed to survive some flooding, Andrews finds damage in the first 6 compartments. Andrews reports to Captain Smith the ship has an hour and a half, maybe 2. The great ship Titanic is doomed. Inquiries into the disaster tried desperately to figure out how much damage the iceberg inflicted upon Titanic.
When the investigations into Titanic's loss convened, they were faced with a problem. The one person who could have told them the most about the ship and what had happened that night, Thomas Andrews, was lost.
Even testimony from survivors was riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies.
That's one of the difficulties in trying to determine what happened, is because as you look at each survivor's testimony, you'll find that each one has a different reaction to what happened.
There was one expert at the inquiry who believed he knew what happened. Naval architect Edward Wilding worked for the shipyard that built Titanic. Wilding proposed the key to understanding the damage could be found in the nature of the flooding. Titanic flooded unevenly in 6 compartments. To Wilding, this meant that each compartment suffered its own unique damage. Wilding also proposed to the investigators that the actual iceberg damage could be very, very small. The press, however, ignored him. Nearly everyone believed that the only thing that could destroy Titanic was a massive gash in her side.
The very well accepted London Graphic had a drawing of the hull showing 15 feet above the keel a big open wound.
This legend of the 300-foot gash has lasted for nearly a century. Matthias and the crew of Natil are retrieved from the icy North Atlantic after 9 hours of investigation. The answer to an old mystery is now within reach. Will they find that Titanic suffered a giant gash or the equivalent of pinpricks? How large was the damage that led to the ultimate destruction of the ship?
Well, here we're coming in. I'm going to come in.
Matthias and his assistant Stephen Derzenko comb through their data.
Right here, okay, and then right there. See that? Okay, we're just starting to see through the mud.
Oh, wow.
Right here. That's a deformation. That's something buried in there.
All right, so what do you think that is?
Well, we have 2 small deformations. two small distortions pretty close to each other.
Can we get, I guess, an approximate size on that?
That one's 5 feet, 5 to 6 feet. And boom, look at that. There's another one.
Yeah, it looks like the same thing.
Well, except it's longer. See it? Goes from here to here.
Two more punctures are discovered in Titanic's hull. For the next several hours, Matthias and Derzenko identify the damage to Titanic compartment by compartment. Then, a new and startling picture begins to emerge with each piece of evidence. The great ship Titanic was not torn open by a giant gaping wound. Just as Edward Wilding predicted, a series of small holes caused the tragic disaster.
Okay, let's see. We have a small hole here near the bow.
As Matthias plots the cracks in Titanic's hull, he believes much of the damage is only as thin as a human finger.
2553 should be right here, and one right next to it here. Okay, then we have a 15-foot hole at 5699, just here, and 2549. Okay, so that's a 15-footer. It starts there, and it runs back. By being able to use our sonar and look through the mud, we've got some indication of a small hole here near the peak, two more small holes about 5 to 10 feet, fairly small here, in cargo hold number 1. And we got a larger hole here that extends back. It's on the order of 15 feet or so. And then we're seeing another 32-foot, approximately 32-foot separation that extends back here into cargo hold number 3. And then finally, the biggest hole is back in boiler room number 6. The separation runs all the way across, apparently back across this transverse bulkhead.
The night of the disaster, the iceberg buckled Titanic's plates and popped rivets. Incredibly, these small wounds started a pattern of flooding that led to the demise of the great ship. Matthias shares the news with naval architects Garsky and Livingstone.
Not a continuous sort of zipper or gash, not a long 300-foot type of opening.
Now other questions are being raised. With such a small amount of damage, just how did Titanic sink so quickly? Here, in the very place where Titanic was built, naval architects are unraveling the mystery of why Titanic sank so fast. How did such minor damage cause the unsinkable ship to founder in just over 2 hours? Working many long hours, 2 researchers have recreated the sinking, relying on Edward Wilding's testimony about the flooding.
Right, what have we got?
Hello, John. This is condition.
Naval architects John Bedford and Chris Hackett have created a computer model that uses many of Wilding's calculations. They agree with Wilding that Titanic was not torn wide open, and that the damage totals a mere 12 square feet, the equivalent surface area of an average-sized person.
And I found that the media and the literature on the subject was so full of misleading information that I began to get interested. And the more we looked at it, then the more surprising things that we found.
Their scenario begins at 11:40. Bedford and Hackett calculate that immediately after impact, the water is rushing in at almost 7 tons per second. Titanic was designed to sustain some flooding, but with 6 compartments flooding simultaneously, all safety gear was rendered useless. Just 10 minutes after the collision, most of the damaged compartments are filled to the top.
According to the inquiry report, you've got the mailroom afloat, which brings it up to 24 feet.
Unaware of the danger therein, 5 men dragging mail to higher ground get caught in the intense flooding and drown.
We can then go on another 10 minutes to midnight. The water's risen to G deck through number 1 hatch.
In a mere 20 minutes after impact, passengers walking along the promenade comment that they suddenly feel as if they're walking downhill. By midnight, Bedford and Hackett estimate that the ship had taken on 8,000 tons of water.
Based on the figures after 20 minutes at 12:20.
12:20. 40 minutes after the collision, the bow is only 15 feet away from being submerged. The first 2 lifeboats are launched, but they are not filled. People still cannot comprehend that the ship is going under.
And that's it there. We've still no water at all really in number 4. And everything is flooded now to the waterline except number 5. The bow is submerged.
1 hour after the iceberg strike, all damaged compartments are filled to the waterline. Bedford and Hackett estimate that Titanic has now taken on 25,000 tons of water. Captain Smith knows time is running out. He orders distress rockets to be fired. Radio operators frantically signal for help. All in vain.
Okay, she's still stable, so we can carry on flooding.
At 1:40, 2 hours after impact, the situation turns even more grim. Brave crewmen who've been supplying power to the ship's lights now scramble for their lives. More compartments flood, pulling the bow underwater. The giant stern heaves up into the night sky. In just over 2 hours, Titanic is lost.
We can carry on filling up and we'll see if that's sufficient to sink her. And it is. And away she goes. That's it. So that's 20 past 2. That's her sunk.
More than 1,500 people were still on the ship as she went down. One of the greatest marvels of her time was sent into the blackness of the sea by some 12 square feet of damage.
At the time, she was the biggest. She was the best. She could beat nature. She could go through an ice floe. She could hit an iceberg. She was unsinkable. She was fast. She was big. But she was a pimple on the ocean. Nature could yawn and knock her aside and did.
The Titanic represented a time of great optimism. It was believed that technology reigned supreme over nature. When the great ship set sail, no one was concerned that there were not enough lifeboats on board. But after this incredible disaster, safety philosophy would change forever. Today, we know unsinkable ships cannot be built. Designs now focus on keeping vessels afloat just long enough to be abandoned.
Okay, first, the signal abandon or distress signal.
Drills are mandatory and help ensure quick evacuation.
Get your gear and meet down on the next floor where all the safety rafts are.
Modern ships also carry enough lifeboats for all on board. This was not the case with Titanic.
Anyway, since the Titanic, there is enough room in the life raft for everybody.
Survival suits like this one are provided to all passengers. They offer protection against freezing seas. Most of Titanic's casualties did not die from drowning, but rather from exposure to ice-cold water.
Time to win 145.
The deep sea is a new frontier. Few people have traveled to the dangerous depths of 12,000 feet. Prototype submersibles like Natil have opened up other worlds. But despite more than a decade of visits to Titanic, there is still much to learn. To biologist Roy Cullimar, Titanic is like another planet, teeming with mysterious microbial life.
That only 5% of the microorganisms on this planet have ever been described or identified. 5%. 95%.
We tend to think of the Earth as a surface. We live on the surface or close to the surface, and the birds fly overhead, the trees grow in the soil, the water laps at the beaches, and we don't realize that there are many biological universes on this planet.
They do not grow on Agar, so we don't see them. Well, we have the...
Cullimar believes that Titanic is now home to a giant community of microbes.
What we've got to do is find new techniques to find these organisms and get them to grow so that we get a broader picture of the organisms that are out there. The Titanic is one side.
He believes the organisms are actually eating Titanic.
Two layers of film here.
Cullimar is building biological traps to capture and identify the bacteria that reside on the wreck.
Closely through the interfacing.
A strip of 35mm film is the bait. film is made with gelatin, which is food for bacteria.
See, already you're doing it much better. No.
The bottom of the tube is baited with food that's rich in iron.
And what they're going to do is they're going to mine the film. They're going to try and take the film, the gelatin off, and so they're going to tunnel, they're going to etch it away, and then we're going to hopefully see some beautiful patterns. Because science isn't just science, it's also art. So what we do is we now put this down.
Colomar hopes to collect bacteria that prefer the iron.
So what we've got...
As these bacteria remove the iron from Titanic, they build these elaborate rust-like structures dubbed rusticles. Colomar believes that the iron-consuming bacteria are the main culprits devouring Titanic.
The ship is starting to disintegrate. And is that disintegration because the rusticles are sucking more and more iron out of the steel, and now the ship cannot support itself, so gradually she's going to go in. Which means the integrity, the structure of the ship, one day will collapse.
What Colomar hopes to do is determine how much of the Titanic has been eaten by the microbe-infested rusticles.
What's frustrating me is, how fast are they growing? How fast are they extracting the iron from the plates of the Titanic? How long will the Titanic last?
As Colomar prepares to gauge the ultimate fate of Titanic, naval architects David Livingstone and Bill Garsky look back to the night of the disaster.
Kilometers away, and we took it right.
Now that they know the true iceberg damage and the pattern of flooding, they are beginning to grapple with one more puzzling mystery.
Now,
How did Titanic break into pieces on calm seas?
This is a really jumbled mass of twisted metal, pipe, cable, wires. You name it, it's there, and it's all crushed up together. It's not
unbelievable.
It's not a very inviting place at all.
It's almost like a giant just ripped it apart.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looks that way.
When the revelation came that the ship was broken in two, it was absolutely astounding to us because of the weight, the credence that we had given the historical reports, and in particular the two investigations that had found that the ship had sank largely intact.
In testimony, all the surviving officers said Titanic sank intact. Others saw the ship break into pieces. Why does history offer such a puzzling account filled with inconsistencies?
There are almost as many interpretations and depictions of the breakup as there are people who gave the testimony.
Survivor Jack Thayer had a sketch made and reproduced on the front page of the Philadelphia Bulletin that clearly shows the ship breaking at the surface. Other testimony depicts the ship breaking when it was underwater.
The controversy is, did the vessel break at the surface? Did it break on the way down? Or did it break when it got to the ocean bottom?
Once you go up, that's your scariest part in terms of she'll start to sway.
David Livingstone will be searching the wreck site for clues to the breakup.
It's quickly the A-frame is going to take you back, and once you do that...
Last-minute advice is given by expedition organizers.
Once you're locked into that pin, and they're decided that he's ready...
Never before has a naval architect explored the Titanic.
Besides being a naval architect, I think any engineer would be fascinated whether we will ever know precisely what happened, I doubt that. I think we can make a guess at what might have happened and in the order in which it might happen.
As Livingstone sinks to the Titanic, the crew on board Ocean Voyager prepares some unique equipment to aid in his dive. 4 specially designed underwater light towers will shine a blazing spotlight on the wreck. The towers generate light power equivalent to 35,000 household bulbs. One half-ton of chain will carry the lights to the bottom of the North Atlantic. Giant lift bags will pull the lights back to the surface once the chains are released. At the Titanic, Livingstone's first task is to place the biological experiments of Roy Colomar on the wreckage of the bridge.
So those are some instruments and tests that we have to place, and it's suggested that they're placed on the bridge.
That's the group. Okay.
But at an area where there should be a lot of corrosion, so that the scientists can see what is happening and what sort of interactions there are.
The experiments will remain here for several days in order to give the bacteria time to gorge on the bait inside. Livingstone slowly moves from the bow to the stern. At the stern, the crew uses Natil's robotic arm to drag the deep sea light towers into position.
We have just moved away a little bit, and we have asked the command to turn on exterior lights to the submarine. Ah, this is beautiful. Yeah. Very, very powerful lights. This is the first time. Now I can see this engine.
A veil of darkness is removed, and Titanic's massive 4-story engines are revealed. The rubble surrounding the engines is all that remains of the stern's once great decks. Livingstone begins to inspect the jagged edges and confusing shadows for clues to the breakup. To his trained eye, the engines seem to have snapped in half.
The port engine, the fact that one of the cylinders is broken off indicates some of the very immense forces that were acting on the hull at that time. The engine itself is a massive structure. Both engines together weighed some 2,600 tons. But the fact that such a big piece of engine has just disappeared, and quite cleanly, indicates some of the forces that were at work during the sinking.
It appears to Livingstone that Titanic broke here, between two of the engines. But he still doesn't know how or why she broke. Nearly 2.5 hours after the collision, as the last of the lifeboats are being lowered, forcers are building to tear Titanic to pieces. Second Officer Charles Lightoller is a witness to the beginning of the end.
Just then, the ship took a slight but definite plunge. Those that didn't disappear underwater right away instinctively started to climb toward the stern, which was rising steadily out of the water. I knew only too well the utter futility of struggling towards the stern. There was only one thing to do. Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body.
As Lightoller and others struggle for their lives, Titanic comes closer to total destruction. From the icy seas, Lightoller describes an astonishing drama.
The bow of the ship was now rapidly going down, and the stern rising higher and higher out of the water. The terrific strain of bringing the after end of that huge hull out of the water opened the expansion joint near number 1 funnel, causing the funnel to fall. Missing me by inches.
From the water, Lightoller saw the ship coming apart. But his harrowing account does not explain Titanic's mangled condition today. David Livingstone returns from Titanic with more questions than answers.
One of the surprising things was the way in which the vessel had broken up. There doesn't appear to be a pattern. One panel of steel is bent one way, its neighbouring panel is bent another way. And no one simple explanation can explain just all the forces that were happening to the ship.
While Livingstone grapples with the puzzle of how Titanic tore to pieces, Bill Garski's colleagues in the United States may be on the verge of some answers. Piece by piece, a virtual Titanic is being built.
Okay, so when you're building a finite element model, if you start off bulkhead by
The computer model is based on key information from the expedition, as well as some of the ship's design plans.
So what we have here
is the Titanic, or the beginning of the finite element model of the Titanic.
This modern engineering tool can begin to reveal the escalating forces that acted on Titanic's hull.
Next we've added a deck, and lastly there's the boat deck.
For the very first time, researchers can begin to calculate the forces that impacted Titanic before she broke. The stresses within the ship are shown with a spectrum of colors. Red represents the most severe. The team first looks at the stresses within Titanic on calm seas.
So I don't see very many stresses in that.
But as the wounded ship fills with water, the stresses in the midsection increase dramatically.
Wow, what is that?
This is the ship just prior to breakup. It's taken on a lot of water in the bow, and that rapid change causes the stresses to increase.
So basically our ship is bending. Forward end of the ship is flooded. The top part of the ship is pulling apart in tension. The bottom or the keel of the ship is compressing, and the steel plates in the keel are actually buckling.
As the bow pulls down, the huge stern rises in the air. The equivalent of a 25-story building suddenly looming above the water.
The stresses that we have in the deck are on the order of 35,000 pounds per square inch. And that's about 50% higher than what the Titanic was actually designed for.
The myriad of stresses within Titanic were so enormous that they overwhelmed the ship. Perhaps most revealing, the model helps to support eyewitness testimony that Titanic broke apart on the surface.
I heard explosions, a sort of rumbling sound. I imagined the decks had blown up with the pressure pulling the boat down. Major Arthur Pushen.
You could see a propeller right clear. And you could see underneath the keel. You could see part of the keel. Joseph Scarrett.
And her lights went dim as she broke clean in two. Steward, Frederick Crowe.
There was no sound for what seemed like hours.
And then the cries for help would seem to go on forever. Emily Ryerson.
The next clue in the great ship's demise is being pulled from the ocean bottom. Today, a piece of Titanic steel is raised to the surface. As the historic relic rises over the nadir, a sense of awe and reverence is felt among the crew. Titanic steel has its own story to tell after nearly a century of burial at sea. The night of the disaster, many survivors claim they heard incredible noises, awful and frightening sounds.
In the case of Titanic, you're talking about thousands of square feet of plate that are being mutilated and torn and giving off a tremendous amount of noise.
Is it possible that the noises heard that night were Titanic steel plates shattering like glass? To answer this question, a key piece of evidence is headed for America. To reconstruct what may have happened, Titanic steel has come here to be dissected and analyzed. Under the guidance of metallurgist Professor H.P. Lely, a team will test to see if Titanic steel is especially brittle. A small sample is cut and loaded into a scanning electron microscope. Metallurgists Chris Ramsey and Scott Miller peer deep into the steel's microstructure.
Pearlite, lots of inclusions. Let's focus it real fast. And then go back down in magnification, see what we have.
They are looking for potential weaknesses and defects in the steel.
Higher magnification shot. Lots of ferrite, pearlite, big inclusion. That's a big one. Probably big old manganese sulfide. That's a big one. Big manganese sulfide.
As they suspected, the steel is full of large manganese sulfide inclusions, chemical imperfections that create weak areas which cause the steel to be brittle. Such was usually the case for steel produced in the early 20th century.
Steels in the turn of the century were made in very small lots, maybe 70 tons, whereas today we make them 400-ton batches. Quality control was a problem in those days.
Certainly compared to today's steels, this is inferior. But for the steels at the time, it was probably about as good as they could do. We got perlite. You wouldn't want to build a ship out of this stuff today.
At the time the Titanic was built, no one suspected that these chemical impurities could make steel fragile under extreme conditions. Investigators suspect that the extreme cold water temperatures of the North Atlantic caused the steel to become even more brittle.
The waters of April 14 to 15, 1912 are unusually cold for the Atlantic at that time of year. 28 degrees seawater is not the ordinary seawater you find in April.
H.P. Lely chills a bar of Titanic steel to the water temperature the night of the disaster. The sample will be subjected to a violent impact. The fractured piece of Titanic is sent to another lab to be examined by mineral scientist Timothy Fakey.
I find it quite exciting to be able to work on steel from the Titanic, to be able to look at the mystery of what all went together to contribute to the sinking.
Fakey's tests confirm that Titanic steel, with its weak manganese sulfide areas, became more brittle when subjected to the cold temperatures.
The fracture surface shows 95% of the grains in the sample cracked.
The lines of the fracture trace back to the weak spots in almost every case.
So you see the effect of manganese sulfide particles on the fracture behavior of this steel. More or less, when you take the steel down to a lower temperature, you're actually shattering something that's just full of holes.
The night of the disaster, as Titanic begins to break, it's likely that much of the ship's steel suffered brittle fracture. This new evidence supports what some survivors heard. Nobody knows for sure what happened to Titanic once she dipped beneath the waves and headed for the ocean floor. Researchers want to know how the bow escaped relatively unscathed. The stern, on the other hand, is completely destroyed. Decks are curled back. The hull is in shambles. What happened to the stern on her way down to the bottom?
We don't have a real fine understanding of what happened as the ship sank from the water surface down to the seabed because of the myriad of forces that are involved here.
It's a fantastic contrast because the forward end actually looks like a ship.
David Livingstone and Bill Garsky are trying to reconstruct what happened to the bow and the stern once they slipped beneath the surface.
It still looks very much like a ship. The railings are there, fantastic shadows.
They believe that as the bow dropped, it was already filled with water, so it was not crushed by the increasing water pressure.
The bow actually is in good condition compared to the stern because of the equalization of pressure during the sinking process to the surface.
The model is not strictly correct.
Livingstone believes that the wreck site holds clues to how the bow arrived in its final position.
On the starboard side, there is this big wave, almost a bow wave of silt, where the ship was pushing in. And there is, and the anchor is, the bottom of the anchor is just about on the silt.
I see.
Another clue to the bow's impact is found on the port side.
Over the top of the bridge, and
to Livingstone's surprise, there's a giant bend in the hull.
at the big radius bend.
The bend on the port side in the hull, it certainly took me by surprise. The condition of the hull in that area where it had bent round, right round 180 degrees in a radius of perhaps about 3 meters, and the hull hadn't fractured. The plates were intact.
What could have happened, Bill, was that the ship was sinking nose down.
Nose down.
But going
sideways
at the same time. And then buried itself into the silt. The back end, just with the momentum of the steel and all the entrained water in it, just wanted to keep going.
Yes.
And squashed up.
Right, that sounds plausible.
It just actually concertinaed and made this big buckle.
Yes.
That is, I think, just about there.
Understanding how the stern arrived on the bottom is a bit more puzzling.
It was number 4, which we had placed in 2 days earlier.
The stern wreckage is chaotic. This, too, is an important clue. Livingstone and Garski think that after the bow pulls the stern underwater, the bow and stern separate. The incredible pressure on air trapped inside the stern causes inward implosions.
Yeah, it's right in the sand. This is the center.
To Livingstone's trained eyes, Titanic's propellers provide clues as to how the stern finally landed on the bottom. The propellers are curiously bent upwards, which suggests that the aft end of the stern hit the bottom first.
And it would almost look as if the aft end hit the bottom, just dropping like a stone. Hit the bottom, which is very hard mud, and then would have stopped in a rather short time, and that would cause classic shock damage. Anything that was not well attached would break loose.
It took some 15,000 people 2 years to build Titanic. She was made with more than 25,000 tons of steel, and her engines produced nearly 50,000 horsepower. But the forces of nature simply tore the greatest ship of her day to pieces in a matter of minutes and spread them out across the ocean floor. Surprisingly, the scattered pieces are not fully mapped. Their final location will now be recorded for history. Over the past several days, the crew of Nadir has been busy modifying Natil. The submersible is outfitted with another of Paul Mathias's sonar devices. Mathias will attempt a first. Using new software technology, he will try to create the first archaeological map of the entire wreck site which is almost 1 square mile.
Well, the Titanic is a huge ship. It's bigger than anything we've ever imaged. It's one giant behemoth on the ocean floor. There has never been a routine, detailed survey of the Titanic.
Preparation for this investigation began half a world away in the warm, shallow waters off the coast of Greece. Matthias was here to fine-tune his imaging technology on Titanic's identical twin, Britannic, which sank 2 years after Titanic during World War I. Sonar image quality largely depends on how close the fish can get to the wreck. As the fish passes over the site, it sends out an acoustic signal. The signal rebounds off the ship, and the software creates an image. In a matter of hours, Britannic is revealed lying on her side on the ocean bottom. Next, Matthias validates what he saw in his ghostly images with an eyewitness inspection of Britannic. By fine-tuning his software here in the shallow seas, he increases his chances of capturing an image of Titanic in extremely deep waters. Matthias confirms much of what his sonar imaged. The railings on the bow, the promenade deck, the great hole caused by her sinking during the First World War, and even her massive propeller. Matthias leaves Greece with high hopes for Titanic. Compared to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, the North Atlantic is deep and dangerous. The weather here is now turning for the worst. There's no guarantee that Matthias will succeed in this inhospitable environment. On his way to Titanic, Matthias prepares his imaging software. "30 feet above the wreck, the team begins scanning the area in a process called mowing the lawn.
What we're doing now is we're scanning across the seabed in the Nautil with a sonar looking out to 600 feet on either side, and we're building up a picture of the seabed. A routine survey has never been done in the area.
This is the first tape of side scan data over the Titanic taken by a submarine. We've also collected the data on optical disc on the computer.
That one's at 2347.
Matthias and Derzenko now begin to plot out the first archaeological map of the Titanic wreck site.
Wow, look at that. Look at that.
That's gotta be it.
That's the bow.
For the first time, the entire bow can be seen on the ocean floor.
That's a nice image. That's a really nice image.
The stern is also revealed.
The broken end of the stern is right here. Yeah, look at that. Looks like it's bent right here.
The sonar mapping has even turned up a surprise.
That is a big piece of the hull right there.
When Titanic broke in half, she was severed in two places, creating a third piece, most of which disintegrated. Now recorded on videotape and plotted on the map, some 60 feet of her hull has been discovered intact. Researchers believe the other half of Titanic's massive engine is under this piece. Further explorations of the site may provide the answer.
Okay, Steve, got the tip of the bow at 5717.
Gradually, a map of the whole wreck site emerges as they first position the bow and stern.
57. Okay.
Okay, the propeller end of the stern is 5170.
The sonar data has also outlined two other important areas.
Also getting debris pattern.
Within these circles lay most of the artifacts from the Titanic disaster. Scattered across the ocean bottom are objects that poured from Titanic as she sank. Each defines the ship's character and tells another part of her story. Many of Titanic's treasures find their way to the French countryside, where they are restored. A protective coat of polish is applied to one of the ship's whistles. Last heard at high noon on the very day Titanic struck the iceberg.
This was Titanic's voice. This is what made her speak. The whistles. And there they are. We have them. We know what they're like. It's one thing reading about them, but to see them gives you an entirely different impression of what they were.
Stefan Pennick belongs to a group of conservation artisans, each with their own unique specialty. As a trained archaeologist, Pennick carefully supervises the preservation of Titanic's artifacts. Master woodworker Terry Palank meticulously reconstructs the wooden base of one of the ship's compasses. Each retrieved object becomes an integral part of a new and historical record.
I think human couldn't live without having their own roots and culture. It's probably the main difference between animals and human people.
The artisans take a minimalist approach to conservation. For them, the objects are more meaningful if they keep a trace of the trauma they suffered. A ceramic figurine. Seawater can pull a glossy surface away from its base. Chemical treatments and air drying will stabilize the cracking. In the hands of Marielle Bouchara, a simple souvenir from Holland is transformed into an object of poignant beauty.
Tiens, reste par là maintenant. Voilà, le côté, tu lui fais un peu de l'oreille de ce côté-là.
Intricate metal lattice work that adorn Titanic deck benches now soak in tubs of chemicals. Pennick monitors the bath for chloride, a leading cause of corrosion in metals. Each object reacts differently when exposed to the sea. Pennick calls on an eclectic background to save the Titanic artifacts.
So in terms of training, you have to be able to understand chemics, physics, degradation processes. You have to be able to understand in terms of history, art, what's the meaning of the object. You can't restore a clock or a car if you don't know a bit of the techniques involved in it.
Isabel Celia Colso puts the tiny components back into a clock. A clock that froze in time on April 15th, 1912. Remarkably, a man's suitcase was recovered from the ocean's floor. Martine Plantek carefully unfolds the garments. Dirt and oxides are washed away from the pants, gloves, and shirts that were so neatly folded and packed for a trip to America so long ago.
The unpacking action is one of the strongest feelings of the conservation process, because that's the time where you do what should have been when you arrive from a trip. You unpack your stuff, and in fact we just switch. It's the guy can't unpack now, and we have the next one. It's very strong in terms of emotion.
Of all Titanic objects being preserved here in France, perhaps the most incredible ones are made of paper.
I think it's unbelievable. If you had to bet about that, no one will bet about having paper being able to be recorded.
Living treasures of music sheets, banknotes, letters, and diaries survived because they were stuffed away inside leather bags, protected from the elements. Today, these personal writings remind us of lives lost.
Roy sends best wishes. Wishes he was traveling like you. I wish you prosperity wherever you go.
Hello, Roy.
Yours sincerely,
Wishing you
Mrs.
a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Hope to hear from you in the new year.
I am just living from day to day for the time when you will be back. I could not be untrue even if I wanted to.
When we put the picture together, when we look at the objects that these people had in their final moments, it gives us, I think, a greater understanding of just exactly who they were. And by knowing the characters in the drama, you get a much better insight into the great drama of that night.
In all, some 5,000 Titanic artifacts have been recovered. Many can now be seen in exhibits throughout the world. Each reaches out in an intimate human way to keep the memory of Titanic alive. The Titanic herself can be considered the ultimate artifact. But the ship can never be raised, never preserved. And unlike the artifacts conserved in France, Titanic is disappearing rapidly with no practical chance at restoration. At the Titanic site, Roy Colomar is retrieving his rustical traps. There may be clues to Titanic's ultimate fate inside these tiny vials.
And maybe we're approaching the time when the Titanic is going to become very fragile. And we need to know how fragile she is becoming.
The rustical structures are extremely delicate, and they are collected gingerly. One day, Titanic too may crumble away. Back in his lab, Colomar is quick to get to work. Etchings in a strip of 35mm film show signs of bacteria. These trails were created as the bacteria ate the gelatin in the film. For Colomar, these colorful etchings are a sign of vigorous life at the Titanic site. Colomar discovers many different kinds of bacteria. The solutions in the red cap tubes show discoloration, proving the existence of iron-eating bacteria. Colomar confirms that iron bacteria are devouring Titanic.
It's a complicated living system, and it's not just one species. We've already isolated a number of community structures of bacteria from there.
Inside the hard shell of the rusticle, Colomar has found bacteria, fungi, and other molds. He injects nutrients into a rusticle to keep it alive. He hopes to discover how they create their unique outer shell. The anatomy of the rusticle is complicated. These life forms embody a web of water channels, ducts, and cavities. The amount of surface area packed into the rusticles is astonishing.
The science of the rusticles is fascinating from the point of view that the rusticle has such a huge surface area. If I took 650 tons of rusticles on the bow of the Titanic, spread the surface area, it would cover 23,000 square miles of surface area. So essentially we're seeing that there's a complex community. We don't understand all of the components. This is a new part of science that we're only just beginning to explore, the edge of yet another universe.
Colomar extracts some of Titanic's iron each time he dries out a sample of rusticle. Judging from the amount of iron collected, he believes that as much as 20% of the bow has been consumed by the organisms.
And from the philosophical point of view, what I see there is we're seeing the inevitability. Everything recycles, absolutely everything.
Today, the story of Titanic is moving into her final chapter. The most luxurious ocean liner in the world is slowly disintegrating, transforming to dust and iron ore. By exploring Titanic before it's too late, the story of her tragedy is kept alive. In the light of morning, the survivors of the Titanic disaster found themselves adrift in the cold North Atlantic. "705 people had survived the cold and dark in lifeboats. 28 men stood until they were rescued on this upside-down boat, often huddled together in prayer. The passenger ship Carpathia rescued many survivors that morning. While the rest of the world waited to hear what had happened, most survivors were silent, quiet, stunned. They would complete their voyage to New York, but nothing had turned out as planned. In Titanic's giant berth, her lifeboats were placed where the great ship should have been. A place of joyous arrival was instead a reminder of tragic loss.
Tragically, a lot of people lost their lives on the Titanic. And I don't think we should dwell on the tragedies so much as learn from the tragedies so that it doesn't happen again. And the Titanic maintains an elegance as if she's saying to us, don't avoid me, but learn from me. Don't avoid tragedies, but learn from tragedies.
Nearly a century ago, the Titanic disaster shocked the world. Even today, we still struggle to understand the events of that night. Science has given us a way to go back in time, to replace myth with fact, to develop new theories, and to reconstruct a defining moment of the 20th century.
We've accomplished a lot on this operation. We've imaged the hull beneath the mudline and detected the damage caused by the iceberg.
Because again, the current was coming this way.
We know perhaps a little better what the mystery of Titanic is all about. It's a question of steel, question of naval architecture, exceeding the limits of what the ship was designed for. That's why she sank, exceeding the limits of what she was designed for.
History is enriched by new discoveries. And the story of Titanic lives on with each new retelling of her tragic tale.
Every expedition really contributes new information. But I think this one really is contributing solid, reliable information, not only in terms of the present condition, but by extension what the ship's future condition will be, as well as what happened in the past.
Titanic represented not so much the end of an era. Titanic represented the pause and the reflection that, well, maybe we're not so great as we thought we were. But I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen again.
The lessons of Titanic still resonate with meaning. Even to this day, the story of this great ship can still touch our hearts.
And so I looked at the ship as she's looming up, and I thought, here is a grey lady, an elegant lady, a queen of the deep. A sad lady, a silent lady, are you now asleep? Can we learn from your sorrow to share? Teach us to understand and certainly to care, that never again will there ever be a grey lady, an elegant lady, slip unwillingly into the sea.